welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we watched Die Hard, which I will say neither of us had seen before, which is absolutely astounding given our proclivity to movies and whatnot, especially my father's proclivity to 80s action movies. This feels like a movie I should have seen when I was like 13. But lo and behold, I'm 24 and saw it for the first time.
And what a film for the holiday season. Because did you know that Die Hard takes place at Christmas and is therefore a Christmas movie for December? And obviously, we are the first people to ever make this particular observation.
Well, Jackson, I would say you are on your own in this regard. I disagree. Die Hard is not a Christmas movie. This is not an argument that's been going on since the year it came out. I am making a new stance. It is not a Christmas movie.
And let us repeat this tired argument for an hour, or please, like, Mother of God, let's not.
Yeah, no, we're moving on. That's it. That was a bad joke. It was a joke, though. We're done. Conversation over.
I felt almost the need to make up for it because I'm pretty sure we unironically left off on that note last week. Anyway, Die Hard was great. Die Hard, I expected this movie to age. I didn't expect it to age poorly, but I expected it to be a situation where I could see what was great about it. I could see what was groundbreaking. I could see what was good and why it was so influential. But I personally wasn't that into it. That's happened for a lot of movies that these kind of really influential ones. I can't think of that many examples off the top of my head, but the one I always go back to is The Matrix. It took me forever to see the first Matrix. It had been out for years, like almost 2 decades at that point by the time I finally saw it. And when I finally watched it, I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool, really interesting piece of film history. But as a movie itself, I wasn't that impressed. I was pretty impressed by Die Hard, if only because it's a surprise. I appreciated it for being surprisingly modest, and I couldn't, for some reason, stop thinking about Kingsman: The Golden Circle, which is, in terms of runtime, only 10 minutes longer than this movie, but feels like a bloated, completely overlong mess of CGI and nonsense, whereas this is really tightly paced. It takes place in a single building, and still manages to be really exciting, really fun, really get your blood pumping. There's some great gore, there's some great sequences, good quips. There's a reason that this is considered one of the greatest action movies. It's a pure action movie. This was excellent. As an interesting piece of movie history, I think it's got some internal struggles, but we'll get to that much later. But just sort of to start off with, as the impression of someone who had never seen it before, had heard it hyped, it lives up to the hype. It is worth watching.
Yeah, for sure. I was just as taken aback by how much I ended up liking it. My significant other watched it with me as well, and she was very much not about the movie in the beginning. She kind of goes into these 80s movies with the expectation that they will be dated with some dated ideology behind them. And I mean, that's not necessarily wrong. You have to have a certain nostalgia for 80s movies to really appreciate them outside of, they're bad movies. Just some of them are just really bad movies that I still really like. But she ended up really enjoying this one as well. It's surprisingly funny. The action behind it's really good. It's one of those movies that manages to tick all my boxes as far as creating a lot of anxiety goes, because there's tight spaces and high buildings, and I don't like either of those. So I spent a lot of the time with my stomach in knots, just being like, I hate this. But in the best way possible. It was very good. It was one of those movies that really reveled in what it could do, and it did what it did well.
Yeah, again, I just keep thinking, like, surprisingly, it's weird for me to say modest, but it does feel surprisingly modest, just because, uh, when you think of an action movie nowadays, when you think of like an Avengers movie, uh, it's always it's weird to go back to this kind of action movie because it doesn't really get made anymore. And the action movies that sell nowadays are like Marvel films, DC films, Transformers movies, really big, really loud, where entire planets are being leveled or whatever. Cities collapsing. But only like one or two really big explosions go off in this movie, and because the movie is paced in such a way that it builds up to it, it's actually really awesome. And yeah, and I guess I was just surprised by how the action itself was still engaging, because even in 80s movies where, like for example, like The Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back is a great movie. But as far as like the non lightsaber action sequences, like when they're just like firing their blasters at each other, it feels very
Dated?
it feels dated, yes, but more so than that, they feel kind of stale, like very rigid. Whereas this, the practical effects really great. I think that having some good gore helps. Whereas like in Star Wars, people just kind of fall down. But in this, people are allowed to like, you really feel the impact of like gunshots. There's a really awesome over the top like shirtless fist fight at the end, and I'm all about that. Yeah, and so just the action itself was much more engaging than I expected it to be, and Alan Rickman is a treasure who we miss more and more every day.
God, I didn't even know Alan Rickman was in this movie. Like, when his name popped up in the credits, I'm like, oh shit, Alan Rickman's in this? And got so incredibly excited. And he delivered everything I wanted and more. It's such a shame.
All that said, I am front-loading a lot of my praise for this movie, just because I do think that as a technical piece of action cinema, it is excellent. As a script, as a story, as a work of art with themes and other things going on beneath the surface. I think the best way would just be repeat what I said on my Twitter immediately after viewing it, because I took to Twitter and called it a highly enjoyable fascist nightmare, and I stand by each and every one of those words, because this movie is not, as Sean alluded to earlier, this movie is not a completely, it's not like 100% like dated, like cringeworthy, in your face stuff, but there was a lot of little stuff in the background that I noticed, like a thing here and there that kind of added up to an interesting picture of what mainstream cinema would have looked like at the time. And we're gonna save that discussion for the end as usual. I think we got some more, I think we both have some more technical comments, just about plot, just about like cool sequences, to talk about at the beginning. So, all that's to say that I'm definitely going to say things about this movie that are harsh and unkind. So I just want everyone to know, still a great movie. But this is a capital P problematic. And with that, I think it's a good time to move into spoilers.
Yeah, so let's continue with our general praise and our general enjoyment first then. We normally talk about like the first couple deaths and how that kind of shapes the whole thing. Instead, we're actually going to kind of focus on death across the board and kind of how each individual one works against the others and what they really did to emphasize certain deaths and minimize others. Mainly in like how they utilized gore and what they did to create kind of a pop effect. Like, you need to pay attention here, and, this isn't as important. This is more just actiony. Like the first couple guys who die. It's a very clever, cool, practical effect of a dude jumping over a desk and popping him in the head. And yeah, it's cool, but there's no blood to it. So
it's very quick. It's very effective as like a shift from, because up until this point it's been John McClane in the airport, him arguing with his wife, establishing that whole plot, that relationship. So we're very clearly in setup mode, and just having such a quick, kind of bloodless death, really, it gets us seamlessly into feeling like, all right, it's action movie time. Like, the plot is really going to start here. But it isn't given a lot of emphasis, and it's just a part. You get the feeling, like, with the efficiency, that it's part of this grand scheme, and it ends up being part of this exceptionally grand scheme. But the death itself, it just kind of keeps going.
And that kind of trend of quick and bloodless death continue for a bit, or at least there's some implied. I don't know that anyone necessarily dies. There's definitely some gunfire when the terrorists arrive at the party. I would argue that it's possible somebody died there, but also entirely plausible that no one did, because they're clearly interested in keeping the hostages alive. So take that how you will. There's an argument either way. And either way, it kind of lays into our argument of, it's not important, but you kind of know it's there in the back of your head. Like, you could have easily written it off, but you're cognizant that someone has died and things are getting real fast. The next major death, however, is the real plot instigator, which is the shooting of Mr. Takagi in the head. And it's bloody, to say the least. It's got a nice big blood squib that splatters on the glass door behind him, and it's gruesome, and it gets you to pay attention to the scene very quickly.
And another detail that I like about this death, I think this is a very good, like, shit gets real death. Like, this, a good illustration of Hans Gruber and his terrorist boys not fucking around, being like the real deal. Because one, McClane sees it. He sees it, and that kind of kicks off his escape and like him trying to like really like think this through. Like, it establishes very well that negotiation is off the table. Alan Rickman himself does it. So we got a nice villainous thing for our big bad. We want our big bad to be memorable, and he is. So this is a nice way to show that by having him get his hands dirty personally. Really comes into play like later, because there are a lot of times in the movie where Hans Gruber seems like more reasonable, like you could talk to him, but then like this does a good job of keeping that like reminder of like no, like he's totally ruthless, like he's willing to like sacrifice everyone to get all his goals. So does a good job of that, and again, just as a visual spectacle in a movie that had been pretty like low key up until this point, just being like, oh shit, gross, and really get you in a visceral way. And that will be our bloodiest death for a while too, I believe.
Yeah, around that time we actually get the first kill of John McClane, who kills Carl's brother, whose name totally escapes me and is pretty much irrelevant.
They all kind of look the same anyway, like the same like blonde, like German henchman.
Yeah, blonde hair, blue eyes, as close to Nazis as you can get without straight up being like, hey, it's a Nazi allegory. Cough, stormtroopers. So he kills this brother, and there's definitely some blood to it. It was a fist fight, and they're both a little bit scratched up and bloodied from it, but there's nowhere near the gore that comes from Mr. Takagi's death, largely because Carl's brother's death was an accident, or at least seems very strongly to have been, as they are tussling and they fall down the steps and his neck snaps.
It's staged in a way that feels like it wants to kind of absolve McClane, because it's brought up, very important detail is that McClane is a cop. He's a cop from New York, and that's something that the terrorist character, the brother, even mentions, like, you can't kill me. So it feels like it's strange then that the movie, maybe not strange, but the movie clearly wants us to be thinking about this, because then that first death, he has him at gunpoint. If the movie wanted McClane to just, like, get it over with, like, he could have very easily. But they stage it in such a way that sort of absolves him of responsibility. And I think it's an interesting touch for kind of this thinking about, like, the role of the police. But more immediately, what it does is that it keeps this escalation of not just the action in general. Like, we get some peaks and valleys, and it's not like a constant, like, upward climb. Like, it's not like it's not like an anime where your first enemy has this power level, your second enemy has this power level, and they just keep climbing. Like, the burst of gore and, like, how elaborate the action sequences are there's a little bit more of, like, peaks and valleys to it. Like, it'll ratchet up real fast and it'll slow down, and it's got a really good rhythm like that. But specifically with McClane as our hero, earlier in our pre-discussion, I compared watching the movie to, like, playing a Metal Gear game. Like, I wouldn't be shocked at all to learn that, like, this was one of Hideo Kojima's primary inspirations for that series. Because, he starts off, like, he's kind of in this, like, fist fight, this tussle, like, all he's got is, like, his hands to work with, then he gets the machine gun, sends the body up, ho, ho, ho. And then, later on, he gets the C4 and makes this huge, cool explosion, and, it's just rad, and there's this great escalation, so that by the time he's just, like, running around with a machine gun and, like, gunning dudes down, like, we have that, we've been ratcheted up to, feel like that is, an appropriate, like, natural evolution of his character. I guess even, I was about to make a comparison again to, Kingsman 2, which just starts off with, Eggsy, like, backflipping out of a car, and then there is nowhere else to go from there. But even in Kingsman 1, which is an action movie that I really love, like, Eggsy is already doing some, like, crazier stuff at the beginning in the car. Like, he's already a really, like, competent, capable person. Whereas John McClane, there is this sense of that by the time he's going, like, hog wild with the machine gun, like, we've really had him pushed to a breaking point.
This whole fluctuation, these peaks and valleys do occur not just in his elevation of weaponry, but in how they portray each death. Like, the idea of bloody versus bloodless death continues throughout the movie, and each action scene does gradually get more and more bloody, but at the same time, the less important action scenes don't have the same level of blood. It's not as brought to the forefront. Like, at one point, he just straight up guns through this guy's kneecaps, and it's gross and it's gory, but it still doesn't equate to Mr. Takagi's death. It's there, it's gore, but it's not make you stand or sit up straight and listen. It's, if you're paying attention, you go, oh. Otherwise, you're like, not that big of a deal. So it's kind of an interesting escalation through non-escalation in a way, just because it keeps itself in check, knowing where to really enunciate with gore, what to punctuate, where to really put it out there. There is one exception I would like to bring up, though, and this is something that is more kind of a pet theory that stood out to me and kind of I've developed as we were talking before we started recording. In that one character is killed in a way that is very bloody and profoundly so. He is basically a no-name henchman. I think he actually does have a name on the IMDb page, but I'm not entirely sure.
I'm sure they've all got names in the scripts, but
yeah,
it's not really important for the purposes of the viewer.
all you really know about him, and this is kind of a racist caricature because he is kind of a racist caricature, so I do apologize. But he is a Asian gentleman with a Fu Manchu, and I, kind of hate saying that, but it's the best description I can give of him. I don't know who he is, and he gets gunned down by McClane in a surprisingly bloody manner, and the reason it's so surprising is because this type of bloody manner had been reserved more for people like Carl or other more big name henchmen that, deserve it. The reason I think this gentleman is interesting is because he didn't deserve it from what we saw. My pet theory is that because this gentleman is not amongst the rest of the Eastern European German gentlemen and very clearly different from the rest of them, was originally supposed to be an actual character or had something bigger cut from the movie, and this was supposed to be his comeuppance. We do see him in brief snippets throughout the rest of the movie where he is taking a Crunch Bar from a candy stand or doing something in the background. But he's definitely a character that stands out from the rest of this goon squad. So to have him die in such a spectacularly gruesome way really leaves me feeling like we're missing something from his character arc.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the death did not stick out to me as much in my first viewing. Like, the beat, the character beat of, like, him getting blown away stuck out more than he did because it comes, right after this. There's some in-between shots of, like, the FBI guys, the Johnson and Johnson, in the helicopter. And but before that, the last thing we see from McClane is the excellent, like, over the top, like, jump kicks and karate chops, like, fist fight with Carl. Is that his name?
Yes.
So we get that, and like, it's a big, like, drawn out slugfest, and getting down and dirty with it, and it ends with, like, a fairly memorable sequence of him, like, hanging this guy from a chain and, like, choking him out. That's the last time we see McClane, is sort of the in that last cut is when we see him at the end of this slugfest. And after Sean brought it up, I went back and, like, kind of rewatched to see when the next time we saw him enter was, and the next time we do is when our henchman here that we've been talking about is blown away, and it's really quick and really efficient. So it makes sense for me as, like, a character beat with, again, that escalation from, like, John hesitating to kill at the beginning, like, and then contrasting the appearance of him in this, like, drawn out struggle versus him just, like, blowing a dude away as soon as he opens the door, like, no hesitation. It works for me as a surprising, effective, like, gory little beat. But I think you're right in that it's interesting in that this character is made to stand out so much, because even more so than Carl, like, again, they all look like blonde German dudes. I could hardly tell them apart most of the time, even though the fact that he's got this vendetta against McClane for killing his brother, like, that's so important, he's still, like, costuming and behavior-wise, like, not as memorable as the racist caricature eating the candy bar. And it's all the more, it'd be one thing if, like, Gruber's team was, like, this diverse group, but not really. It's just, like, you got Alan Rickman, who's memorable because he's Alan Rickman. You have the tech specialist, who is black, and, he's not involved in the action most of the time. They cut away to him, like, ticking away on the computer. You have, like, 10 or so, like, samey looking German dudes, and then you have this last henchman, who is, again, like, given a beat that's, like, kind of funny and, like, kind of humanizing. So it's weird. It is weird that, like, he's the one who gets, like, who is the receiver of this, like, moment of, like the appearance of, like, the self-assured McClane just, like, blowing a dude away after beating the mini-boss, basically. So, yeah, I don't know if it's just a case of, like, maybe, like, the casting was weird for some reason. Maybe they did like cut something out. I don't know, but it definitely does like stick out in an interesting way.
Well, I did just do a quick Google search on this gentleman. He is named Uli in the movie, and he's played by Al Leong. So apologize to Al, because he's apparently actually a very prolific actor and is in a lot of other things as relatively well-known characters. So apologies to you, Mr. Leong. I did not mean to minimize your role in film.
Good going, Sean.
I know, I'm sorry. But it was just kind of a weirdly, you are kind of a minimized character within this movie. It feels like something's missing. Like I would like to know more about you.
Oh, it's weird. It's like Schrodinger's henchman, kind of, in that he is both like he is both memorable and not memorable. Like his character is written to not be memorable, but then he has like the candy bar and gets this really memorable death. So like I don't know what's up with it.
Oh my God, Schrodinger's henchman is great. Oh, holy shit!
I kind of want to talk about John McClane a little bit because I think he's a very interesting character, not necessarily in the way he was written. I mean, there are some fun things about the way he was written, but more so about John McClane's like place in pop culture as kind of the action hero. Because one thing that stuck out to me about this movie is that John McClane has become kind of a like iconic 80s action hero, kind of this iconic character, you know, came back for several sequels, one of Bruce Willis's best known roles, and the way that culture has shifted has, I think, diluted a little bit of the original purpose of his character, but I'm not entirely sure how effective that purpose was in the first place. So John McClane, watching it now, feels very much in line, or at least to me watching it, like very much in line with a classic sort of action hero. Like, you know, again, like blows dudes away, like does the rappelling off of the building after a big explosion, and it's awesome, and he makes quips, and you know, he gets in the like brutal like slugfest. He looks decently cut in like his tank top, and that's all, you know, that feels all very in line of what we expect an action movie hero to be. And they even have a conversation about this in the movie, about how Hans Gruber like keeps calling him like a cowboy, and like they had this whole conversation about like, you know, him being like an action movie hero, and the movie's a little bit aware of that. But it's so weird now, and I think part of this just like the lost context is that by the film clearly wants to showcase some sort of vulnerability from McClane. You know, and this is something that I had to have pointed out to me just because like I was so focused on like, man, like there is a lot, like this movie is actually like pretty like way more like macho than I was expecting it to be. And but you know, there's the whole, that's why they focus so much on his feet and like the bloody foot and the way that he just looks like ragged and like out of breath, and like he's sitting there in the corner begging not to die and like trying to get a hold of himself, and there are these moments of vulnerability from him. And I'm wondering if that was supposed to be a bigger thematic purpose in the movie that maybe doesn't really work for me, basically for two main reasons. And the first is just action movie culture more generally. The second, I think, is more pertinent to like the subplot with his wife. So action movie culture more generally, like if you think about Kingsman's a great example. If you think about who our action stars are now, they're not especially like, sure, you get like your Chris Evans like being really ripped for Captain America, but just as often you'll get like a Tony Stark, like a Robert Downey Jr., whose every single action is done behind a CGI creation. And again, Kingsman, great example of this. Its main star, its main action hero is this not particularly impressive looking like young dude, and he's pretty skinny, like, and not even compared to like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, does not scream like particularly macho. So, just the fact that like you can take like actors with a little bit less of that like physicality, a little bit less of that gruffness, and kind of elevate them with technology, I think just pushes like action movies in kind of a bit of a different direction. So I think, just by contrast, like McClane ends up looking like a lot more tough and macho than a lot of modern action movie characters, even though, like, think about the context at the time, like, versus like the Stallones and the Schwarzeneggers of like the 80s era, because this would have been like towards the end of that era. Like, it came out in 1988, I think. It's like McClane definitely in comparison seems a lot more humanized, but just compared to today feels a lot more macho. But I think what really this element, this machismo element that really doesn't land so much for me is the subplot with his wife. At the beginning, it's sort of established that John McClane is kind of aloof, like like he ends up like turning his head at other girls, and he's got this strained relationship with his wife, and he's really dedicated to his work back in New York, and his wife is modern businesswoman, wants to like climb the corporate ladder, takes a different last name, and they have this whole like argument about that. And so the text of the movie wants to put John McClane in these vulnerable situations where he's like kind of begging for his life and like flying by the seat of his pants and like not sure if he's going to be killed any moment, and like try to expose that vulnerability. And this really best shown through, I think, like some of my favorite scenes of the movie is when he's talking to Al, the police officer, over the radio, and they kind of have this bond and like talk to each other, and like he almost confides in Al a little bit. And especially this is made more explicit when he doesn't think he's going to make it out. Like, he's facing the improbable odds of his mortality, and he's explaining like, I should have been more understanding with my wife, like I shouldn't have been so dedicated to my work, should have gotten behind her more, etc., etc., etc. So we have kind of a macho dude put into like a life-threatening situation where he has to confront his own mortality, confront his own vulnerability, and ends up growing and repairing the relationship with his wife as a result of that. Okay, fine, perfectly acceptable character arc for an action movie. The problem with this is that whole through line is running through the movie, but the other through line is the one we were talking about earlier, how he's like earning his confidence to kill, being a lot more kind of more crazed and more violent. And I think notably that whole speech he gives to Al about wanting to be more open, like his wife never hears that in the text of the movie. Like, presumably she hears that eventually, like after they ride off into the sunset and she punches a reporter. But
an important note.
I think it is kind of an important note, though, because I'm going to kind of come back to that. And so that's not where the movie ends. That's not where the reconciliation happens. The reconciliation happens is through him tossing Hans Gruber off of a building. In fact, like, it's not just him tossing Hans Gruber off of the building. It's Hans slipping on the watch that was made a big deal out of earlier in the movie, that she has this watch as part of like her job. And so Hans slips away with the watch and falls to his death. And so what basically ends up happening in like the text of that moment and like the text of the movie is that we have kind of grouchy macho asshole John McClane, too dedicated to his work in New York, police work, again, very, very tough, very like, gotta keep the streets clean, I'm a real man, like that kind of work. And then he repairs that relationship that is taking a hit as a result of this attitude by being more macho. And the fact that he slips away with the watch, it's almost like the movie is saying, like, Mrs. McClane, like, you should have just listen to your husband and everything, everyone should be more tough and manly just like him. And I think it's a weird note to end on, her punching the reporter, because it's almost like the movie is like giving in with like weirdly wanting John to be right in the conflict, even though like the stated text of the movie, like the dialogue, wants him to be more human. And I think these are just two like elements of the movie and elements of the character that like aren't really reconciled too well.
That's actually like a really good point. Is the punching of the reporter felt like a very strong feminist moment in a way, where Holly McClane just like, all right, fuck you, I'm done with this shit. I am taking control of my own life, and you brought our kids into this, and all that good stuff. But in the context that you've presented, it does take on an entirely different meaning. One of far more violence is the answer to everything. Be macho, take your matters into your own hand, and then use that hand to punch somebody in the face with it.
It's a theme that's like, you can argue whether or not that's an unavoidable aspect of action movies, where that is ultimately the theme of every action movie. But I think there are ways where like filmmakers will play with that, or like lean into that, or like have a bit more commentary on the violence and death in the movie. Like Fury Road, Mad Max Fury Road is a good example of this, in that like there is a lot of like violence and conflict, but it is presented more as like a kind of struggle, even though it's also a struggle that we as the audience are supposed to enjoy as like a over the top like lengthy car chase. Like there's a bit more emphasis put on that. So even if there is still that element of like the movie Mad Max Fury Road is aware that like the inherent theme of action movies is like violence is the answer, and then proceeds to like pretty much work from there. This movie, it feels like, again, just has like two completely different stated ideas.
The one thing that you are right in that there is almost a weird duality to it, of one side is saying, be aware of your own mortality and acknowledge your fears and don't necessarily just go out and be full macho man. And then the other half of this is saying, that is the answer. Do what you need to do. Take it into your own hand. Everything we've been saying. But weirdly enough, I don't think that it's necessarily a duality as it is a presented spectrum within the movie. Because as we were saying, is the entire movie was them earning the ability to do this. It starts off subtly in small kills from John, where he accidentally breaks the dude's neck before he is throwing people off buildings and shooting people in the head. It's a build-up. Similarly, Holly doesn't just punch this reporter for no reason because he's in her face after she just went through this whole ordeal. He brought their children into it and almost fucked up the whole operation. There's almost a weird don't be macho unless you've earned it type of message to it that almost feels like nothing. Like that doesn't really mean anything. It's just kind of it's there, and like that's almost what it's presenting, because as I said, everything is an escalation, but it's not like a definitive be macho or don't be macho. It's earn being macho.
Well, there is one more angle to this question about whether the macho-ness, the violence, the death is something to be like celebrated or aspire towards in this movie. And I think that's recall earlier in the episode, I just sort of left it there and didn't really address it when I said that this movie was a highly enjoyable fascist nightmare. I'm addressing it now. Like I left, don't worry, we were coming back to that.
fair warning, this might get a little political, but we're going to try and keep it within context of this was a movie released in the 80s. Look at it as how it would be perceived nowadays. So if that's not really your jam, you don't have to listen to it. I don't blame you, but just a heads up.
I think it's an interesting thought, especially when you consider that, I guess I don't know if that would have been the Reagan or Bush era at that point yet. But, it's an interesting little thought in comparison to the current times. So, one of the motifs I kind of saw throughout this movie was sort of this rejection of what we might call, like, some sort of elites. And the movie, I think, uses elites as kind of a broad brush. It applies to the, super criminals who have all the money to do this operation and have these extremely complex plans. Like, certainly, it applies to them. It applies to the chief of police. It applies to the FBI agents who are presented alternately as being, like, bumbling and incompetent and playing right into the villain's plans and getting killed for it. Or just, and also just kind of, like, bloodthirsty. Like, the FBI agents going, like, yeehaw! Like, we're gonna blow them up! Because when you think of an FBI agent, you don't think of your regular on-the-streets, friendly neighborhood police officer. They are the feds. They call them that in the movie. They are the high, like, confidential government, wing of the government, basically. Even with the reporter, if this movie were made now, the Holly, after punching that guy, could have shouted that he was fake news, and it would not have been out of place if it were made now. And so that's sort of who. Unless we forget, Mr. Takagi is presented as in a pretty understandable, noble way. But if you look at the other business types in the movie, if you look at Ellis, the sleazy, hitting on Holly and trying to give up John McClane and gets killed for it. That's again very clearly like stuffy, rich, like business suit guy, and he's just one of many characters who are positioned either through money or influence or whatever as having this kind of status. Now, by contrast, we have our main heroes. We have John McClane, who is of course just a like beat cop from New York, like really likes to get down and dirty and try and help things. And then you have Al, who's the resolution of Al's character arc. I say that most of the movie you can watch it now and not be cringing too much, but Al's final moment is really what stood out to me as being like, no! So, at the end of the movie, we learn earlier on that Al is relegated to desk work. And this is presented as sort of a failing. Like, he's not allowed to get out there in the field anymore and do some real good with, like, the real cops like John McClane. And we find out that the reason that this is that Al accidentally murdered a 13-year-old kid. And it's a moment when we first learn this information, the moment isn't played like in a way that's super tacky. It definitely feels a bit strange that this would just be something that one of our main like favorite hero characters has in his past, and we're just kind of supposed to sympathize and look past. It's a little bit, it's weird in that way. But this movie came out before Rodney King. America, of course, has a long history of police brutality ever since its inception. So, but I feel like, like from the perspective of like media attention, being pre-Rodney King means that a lot of film goers might not have like thought of it in quite the same way, and especially not after it's been happening for years and years since then with Ferguson and all the instances of police brutality happening today. So we get that backstory, and it seems like it's going to be kind of left there. And then, as sort of our last little stinger, after Hans Gruber is tossed off the building and McClane emerges with Holly, Carl, or one of the henchmen, again, I can't even tell, I'm pretty sure it was Carl, turns out to be still alive, and he pulls a gun out and is ready to shoot. And Al is the one to put him down with his own gun, after previously talking about how he was afraid to point a gun at someone and get involved in the field. So, what we have here is a character arc for a police character who is basically learning to kill again. and that's where I think the movie, like, again, it was kind of uncomfortable before that conversation. That's where the fact that the movie is now, like, doubling down on, like, nah, like, he's got to stay the course, like, reinforce order and justice, and he's, do something meaningful for a change. Like, that's where I think, the movie starts to earn the title of being a little fascistic in some ways. And it's strange to say that because, I had just explained, like, well, what about all the fact that so many of the bad guys are presented as being kind of these, like, elites? Like, that doesn't seem to, like, play into this, like, idea of the movie having this fascist bent. But if your movie's stated theme, and this is, playing along with, like, John McClane was right all along. John McClane, like, hardworking cop who knows how things really are, was right all along. And you pair that with, like, this act of violence elevating this other police officer who it is worth mentioning that, this character, Al, is black. And, that seems to throw a bit of a wrench into things. But regardless of, just like in real life, regardless of, like, an individual cop's, like, race, it still doesn't stop overall the institution of the police of being, like, a highly, a source of racist violence. And, and so the fact that we have, basically the central theme of the movie, the most coherent theme of the movie that I can pick out, is basically, like, listen to, like, the cops on the streets who know how things really are, is really hella uncomfortable in 2017, especially when Donald Trump is the president and you have all these instances of this police brutality that happens daily. And even though at the end of the movie, Al's the person that Al shoots is, like, a terrorist, and he's this German guy, and it's not, it's not, like, him shooting, like, another kid on accident or anything like that. It's still the fact that is his character arc, going from disgraced, like, desk jockey who isn't doing the finger quotes, like, real work, to earning his redemption in the eyes of, the cop, the hero John McClane, by saving him with this killing of just, I don't know, I think it's fucked.
I see where you're coming from. I don't think that your argument is wrong, and I think it's definitely an interesting thought piece for the context of the movies that we were watching and the way that our world is currently perceived. I think it's a very interesting idea. I didn't pick up on it to the same extent that you did. I definitely agree that the fact that it culminates in Al shooting a gentleman in the head as his character arc resolution is more than a little fucked. But for the most part, I just kind of wrote it off as an 80s movie. And I mean, there is definitely something wrong in doing that, because movies are always a product of their culture, but when watched under a new lens, must be reconciled with the world that we currently see them in. So the fact that I didn't perceive what you saw isn't necessarily a fact that it's not there. It just might have been that I was watching this movie under the guise of assuming it was just going to be an 80s movie and not an 80s movie that we were watching 30 years down the line.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing with old movies. One of the reasons I like watching old movies is actually, I think I may have been, I was about to say maybe I'd be less likely to pick up on it in like a movie that was released today. For this particular example, I don't know if that's true. I don't think that's true.
No, that would have been one picked up instantly by everyone.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't pick it up in the theater, I would have picked it up on like the BuzzFeed piece about it that got shared to my Twitter. But so this movie's not a good example. When I watch old movies, I like to approach them from kind of this historical context. I think that's part of, after going on about this long spiel about police brutality, I hesitate to say that's part of the fun, but it is interesting to me to like think about the way something would be perceived now, like the cultural context of how it was made back then, and like what has changed, what hasn't changed, what's more acceptable, what's less acceptable. So I think weirdly when I watch old movies, like I'm almost more on the lookout for this kind of stuff. And I certainly was for this movie, I guess, full disclosure, because one of the few things I knew about it was that the plot was about him trying to reconcile with his wife, which left me with the sort of questions that I talked about earlier about, okay, so how is this resolution going to play out? Is it going to be like him having a conversation, or is she going to be kind of like damsel in distress, or like how is this going to play out? And it played out in a way that I was kind of on the lookout for, and so my mind, admittedly was already a little bit attuned to that sort of thinking, just because it is an old movie, and I would like to stress that again, I stand by my description of Die Hard that I gave earlier, but even though I think it's kind of a fascist nightmare, it is a highly enjoyable fascist nightmare. It's still funny, it's still well directed, the action itself is still really well done, and this is just kind of an unfortunate element that really isn't too uncomfortable until the end. So it's not something I would say. I'm not offended by the existence of Die Hard.
And to be perfectly honest, the one thing that I did notice a little bit of as I was going through it was there's a surprising amount of representation within this movie. There's definitely some caricatures and stereotypes present as well, but the main cop outside of John McClane is a African-American gentleman. The bad guy in charge of tech is also African-American, and it's very interesting to see these gentlemen represented not as stereotypes, but as actual individuals, especially for a movie in the late 80s. There's a surprising amount of representation in that regard. So I guess fascism notwithstanding, it's a pretty solid movie.
Put that one on the box. Beating a dead horse. Pretty solid movie. Fascism notwithstanding.
With that, I think we are going to wrap it up, though. As always, I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also find me on Twitch every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday at Helpless_Skippy.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at JacksonJKeller, where I don't always have something special to say on Twitter, guys. Sometimes it'll just be retweets of smarter people. So, if you want to see some smart people to follow, my Twitter's the place to go, baby.
If you want more news about the podcast, things coming up, things that we've got going on, head over to Twitter at BADH_cast. As always, we'd like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. As a side note, Lords of the Highway have actually just gotten on Twitter as well. If you'd like to follow them, it's at Lords of Highway. Pretty cool band to keep up with. Next week is going to be something very, very special. And that's all I really want to say about it. you don't need to have seen this movie beforehand. I can guarantee you that much. Until next week, though, please enjoy this poignant musical number.
I'm grooving. I'm Hans Gruber and I'm grooving. And sometimes that can mean shooting. Mr. Takagi in the
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go